Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we have the case of the Candyman or Dean Arnold Corll, so this case is going to take a while. We're going to spend an hour here talking about this killer and all the victims. So it's a bit graphic, I don't show images or get too descriptive, but we are going to go into more detail than in other videos. By the way, I recommend you have a cup of tea. I'm here with my cup of coffee, obviously, because I need the energy. But have something to drink, relax a bit, because this is going to take a while, although I don't recommend eating. On the screen, you can see my other cases. Below are my social media accounts if you'd like to follow me. And without anything else to say, let's begin. He was Dean Arnold Corll. He was born on December 24, 1939 in Fort Wayne in the state of Indiana, United States. His parents were Mary Robinson and Arnold Edwin Corll. It is said that Dean's father was quite strict with him, while his mother, on the other hand, was overprotective. And she had reasons for this, since Dean suffered from what is known as a heart murmur. This was because he had an undiagnosed case of rheumatic fever, which left him with this murmur as a consequence, which would be diagnosed years later, in 1950. That not only made physical activity difficult, but also caused the other kids to bully him. They laughed at him because he couldn't participate in gym class at school. Arnold, Dean's father, would later admit that he actually didn't like children. More than strict, he could be a bit cruel. Dean's parents divorced in 1946 when he was only 7 years old. Let's remember that at that time, divorces were rare and were looked down upon by society. Even though they were separated, Mary wanted the family to stay together for their children, so they all moved to Memphis, where Arnold had been stationed with the Air Force. At some point, Dean's parents managed to reconcile and decided they would move to a town called Pasadena in the state of Texas. They only stayed together for 3 more years, after finally separating and still in Pasadena. Mary got married again to a watch salesman named Jake West, who also brought his daughter Joyce to join the family. On the other hand, Mary started a family candy business, which they called Pick and Prince, and Dean helped with it. The children worked together to make the candies and then gave them to Jake, who, being a traveling salesman, distributed them wherever he went. I think you can already imagine where the nickname Candyman came from. In his childhood, Dean was described as a shy boy who had trouble socializing and was also very bright at school. As I mentioned before, Dean didn't usually hang out with classmates, he didn't have friends because they laughed at him, and he simply ended up not wanting to interact with people. That's why he spent his free time on music and playing the trombone. His best time was in high school, where despite being a lonely person, he did the activities he liked and also dated some girls during that time. When he turned 19, Dean and his family moved again, but this time they settled in Houston Heights, where they continued with the candy business and opened a small store. Keep in mind that until that moment, the family worked however they could from their home's garage. So having a physical store outside their home was a big step forward. By then, Mary asked Dean to go take care of his paternal grandmother, who had recently become a widow. So Dean went to Indiana for 2 years, leaving the candy store behind. When he returned, he started living in an apartment above the store, and the neighbors in the neighborhood gave him the nickname Candyman. It turns out that Dean had started giving candy to every young person he came across. He also began habitually inviting boys over, teenagers to the store outside of business hours. By then, his stepfather already suspected he might be gay, but Mary was sure her son wasn't homosexual. After a while, Mary divorced Jake West and opened a new store under a different name, Corll Candy Company. Dean became the vice director of the company, which started doing well in sales and already had several employees. It was during that time that a young employee of the company decided to tell Mary that Dean had tried to make some sexual advances toward him. Imagine this happening around the 1960s, more or less, and there was a lot of rejection toward homosexuality. In fact, Mary was homophobic and wanted to cover up what her son was doing. So instead of listening to this employee, she fired him. This way, she managed to keep ignoring her son's sexual orientation for a while longer. In 1964, Dean was drafted into the Army despite his heart condition. He ended up going to Louisiana for basic training. Incredibly, what got him out of the Army wasn't his physical health. First, they transferred him to radio repair services, and then he said that his mother needed her son for the family business, so he was discharged honorably. Although, by that time, we could assume that the main reason he wanted to leave was because of his time in the Army. He had discovered more about his homosexuality since he would later confess to his friends that he had had several experiences with fellow soldiers. Well, actually, at that time they would discharge soldiers from the Army for being gay, not as a crime but as a medical condition. Even so, that's not what happened to Dean once he was back home. After his short 10-month stint in the Army, Dean became the director of the candy company. And the neighbors claimed that the young man spent much of the day surrounded by children to whom he gave candy. Even so, Dean kept a good appearance in front of people and even had a girlfriend with children who called him Daddy. But, as some of you may already know, keeping up appearances is one of the things that the worst killers do very well. No one seemed to suspect that he was actually a sadistic person who sought sexual pleasure in torturing others. The perception people had of him, that of a man who gave candy to young people and children, changed completely. In the early morning of August 8, 1973, a few years later, 911. That morning she received a call that finally she discovered everything that Dean Arnold Corll had done in secret. A young man named Henley told the operator that the police needed to come quickly to where he was because he had killed a man. When the officers arrived, they saw two very frightened people, a woman and a man. They also saw another man, bigger than them, lying on the floor, surrounded by blood and 6 bullets in his body. And finally, they met the person who had made the call, Henley. He begins to explain how they had gotten into that situation and how he himself had helped the killer, who at that moment was lying dead on the floor. What I'm going to tell you next are the crimes of the Candyman, told just as Henley did at that moment. In 1967, Dean met David Owen Brooks, who was 12 years old, and began sexually abusing him in exchange for money and candy. The young boy had a strong bond with Dean, whom he saw as a father figure, and Dean took advantage of that relationship for sexual purposes. David Brooks had come into Dean's hands thanks to a pool table that he set up in one of the candy factories across from his school. There he saw that Dean treated him decently, unlike the rest of the world, which included his classmates and his parents. When Brooks needed something because he fought with his family, Dean let him stay at his apartment and also gave him money when he asked for it. But there were conditions. Actually, Dean convinced him to exchange oral sex for money and gifts. Meanwhile, Dean's mother closed the candy store and moved to Colorado. For his part, he decided to work testing relays at an electric company. There, Dean had access to acrylic paint, which later would allow him to lure more young people with the promise of getting high by inhaling some of the acrylic paint. One day, Dean wanted something more, so he took 2 teenagers with him to sexually torture them. Brooks entered his house and saw these 2 young men tied to a large wooden board being tortured. The large wooden board is something that remained for the rest of Dean's years of murders. When Dean saw the boy come in, he offered not to say anything, and in exchange he would get a car. After this and accepting what he was doing, he told him that if he brought another boy, he would get $200. Dean's extortion and influence over the young man was such that in 1971, Brooks introduced his friend Elmer Wayne Henley under the excuse that Dean had a job for them. Elmer Wayne Henley was born on May 9, 1956, being the oldest of 4 siblings. He had an alcoholic and abusive father, but also a protective mother who wanted the best for her children. In 1970, his parents got divorced and he started working to help his mother support the household. This is also why at that time he decided to leave school. Those very reasons made it much easier for him to fall into Dean's hands, since he had a great need to earn money. No matter what, Henley arrived with the same problems as Brooks. In fact, one of the main things they had in common was their parents' fights. At 15, when he left school, she did too. They had started spending a lot of time together, skipping classes, and there skipping classes, looking for fun and comfort. Do you know Dean? They told Henley that sometimes they robbed houses and that if he helped them, he could make some extra money for his mother, whom he lived with at the time. On one occasion, Dean asked Henley if he would be willing to kill if it ever became necessary, and he said yes. That's when Dean decided to make him the same offer he made to Brooks. He would give him $200 each for every young man they brought to the house. Although Henley actually, according to him, didn't know what he wanted them for, he just saw easy money, he said. Yes, I can do this, bringing the kids, the teenage boys, to your house by tricking them, and I'm not going to ask many questions. Sometime later, some friends of Henley, David Hilligist and Mally Winkle, disappeared on their way to the public pool. Clearly, at that time, Henley had no idea what could have happened to them, or in any case, who took them. Dean liked to torture the boys in different ways, like pulling out their pubic hair one by one with tweezers. He would insert pieces of glass into their penises, and then break the glass as well as insert dildos into their cavities before raping them. He made sure there was no noise by covering his victims' mouths and playing loud music. But also, to keep things clean, he would put plastic wrap under the wooden board where he placed them. Sometimes he even castrated them, and on some occasions he did this with his teeth. That's how, in total, with the help of Brooks and Henley, Dean abused and murdered at least 16 teenagers. They all lived in the Houston Heights neighborhood and were acquaintances of Brooks and Henley. Dean's first victim was not a young man from Houston Heights, but rather Jeffrey Connon, an 18-year-old boy who was hitchhiking on the Westheimer Road. On September 25, 1970, it was there that Dean picked him up with his truck and offered to take him to his home on Bracewood Place. But once inside the vehicle, Dean abused Jeffrey, and after strangling him, he buried him at High Island Beach. Actually, Jeff didn't fit Dean's taste for young boys, but he assumed Jeffrey was a friend. Since he looked younger, Dean could have really mistaken him for a teenager, which made things even worse, obviously. The family tried to report the disappearance, but since he wasn't 15 years old, so to speak, they considered him responsible for his own life. They assumed he had simply left home and gone somewhere else of his own free will, so they wouldn't look for him. And here I want to make a small note. In this particular case, they said he's not very old. We won't search for him since he's a teenager. As a responsible adult, he likely left voluntarily. And it would be acceptable if this were true, if they had really searched for the other victims, the minors, but that wasn't the case. And I'm already telling you, if you remember my other cases in which the police are pretty useless, where I complain about the incompetence of some police departments. In this case, you can't imagine what the Houston Police Department was like. It was as if it didn't exist. There was basically no police department. They did absolutely nothing. Most of the families in this case, if not all, basically write the same thing, which is that no one gave them any attention when they needed it from the police department. No one followed up. The rest of the victims were brought to Dean by Brooks and Henry. The gang's modus operandi worked as follows. The boys attracted the attention of their victims by offering to take them home or with the excuse of taking them to a party. That's how the victims ended up at Dean's house. And once there, they were drugged so they would lose consciousness. Dean would undress the teenagers and tie them up, sometimes on a bed, but usually he would bind them to a torture board where they were gagged, sexually abused, beaten, tortured, castrated, and mutilated with knives, razors, and scissors. Until finally, after hours or even several days of torture, they were killed with a .22 caliber pistol. Then, Dean would get rid of the bodies by covering them with lime and wrapping them in plastic sheets, as if they were candies. By July 1973, Henley had started taking driving lessons in Bel Air. In this place, he met several people, and from there, he was able to find 1 or 2 victims. In fact, to this day, one of the people who met him in this place says that she survived and tells how Rick Daniels had gone out for a smoke with Henry when he suggested going to a party that night. In fact, he agreed he was going to go, but in the end, he couldn't find anyone to give him a ride. So he ended up not being able to attend this supposed party and thus avoided a terrible death. However, someone who wasn't as lucky was Homer Luis Garcia, a 15-year-old boy who also met Henley at the Bel Air driving school. And he didn't escape from this supposed party. He asked his mother for permission, she said yes, and he left never to return. 3 months after the murder of Jeffrey, on December 13, 1970. David Brooks tricks Danny Yates and James Glass, 15 and 14 years old, into getting into his car under the pretense of taking them home. Yates had a girlfriend at that time, Betty McCool Johnson. To this day, she still keeps photos of him in a little jewelry box that she cherishes. Even though she moved on with her life, got married, and had a child, she still remembers Danny Yates. In the best way possible, trying not to remember the horrible end his life had. As a curiosity, at that time, Brooks was driving a 1969 Chevrolet Corvette, which Dean himself had bought for him. Once in the car, then, with these young men, Brooks drove to Dean's house, where both boys were tortured and strangled as usual. Both cases ended up in the hands of 2 different police officers who didn't make the connection that they had disappeared in the same way at the same time. Because of this, it was immediately assumed that Glass had run away from home since he had done so before after an argument with his father. Yates ended up on the other side due to his long hair. Someone said for some reason that they had seen him in a house where other runaways would gather. So the police just took that as a fact and stopped looking for him, saying he had left of his own free will. Basically, if there was no physical evidence that someone had taken them or anything like that, they weren't going to look for them. They also had supposed testimony of seeing Yates, so he must have been fine and they wouldn't investigate further. A whole search for a couple of fugitives. I trust that today things have changed, but honestly, I'm not really sure that's the case. Their families likewise never stopped looking for them. Yates's father blamed himself for being so hard on his son, and Glass's mother kept seeing him everywhere. If she saw a teenager on the road, she would shout that it was her son and insist they go back to look for him. Unfortunately, the Candyman acted quickly, and by that time both boys were already dead and buried. There was nothing else to be done. Willie Glass, a relative of the missing boy, shared the following about his mother and how she handled the case. Then one day she took a gun and grabbed my younger sister, Pamela, and dragged her into a back room. When the Special Weapons and Tactics team arrived, she fired at the floor and shouted, "You're not going to take Pamela from me like you did with my Jimmy." We took the gun away from her and took her to the psychiatric unit at Harris County. She was never the same, and neither were the rest of us. Dean Corll didn't just kill 27 children, he killed 27 families. On Dean's side, Corll, he decided to move and get an apartment on Mangum Road because he had kidnapped one of the boys too close to his house. Danny and James were followed by Donald and Jerry Waldrop, 17 and 13 years old, who were kidnapped on January 30th, 1971. As usual, somehow Dean managed to trick them, probably with the promise of some marijuana or alcohol. Dean tied them to the torture board he used to use, One was handcuffed by one hand and one ankle on one side of the board, the other exactly the opposite. As part of the torture, the brothers were told that the one who managed to beat the other to death, still handcuffed by one hand to the board, would be set free. The two spent the day fighting to defeat their brother, using only their free hand until both were nearly dead. In reality, neither of them survived because when Dean came back, he simply strangled them both and got rid of their bodies, as usual. The police not only failed to connect this case with the others, but they also kept treating the disappearance of teenagers as if they had just run away from home. For 8 months, the father of these two boys tried unsuccessfully to get them to do something to look for his sons. He literally went to the police station to ask them to do something, and their response was, "What are you doing here? Why don't you just go home?" They never told him they were going to investigate. They never did absolutely anything for his sons. 2 months later, on March 9th of the same year, Randall Lee Harvey, 15 years old, disappeared while he was on his way home. After he hadn't returned for 2 days, his mother filed a missing person report and later called the police to warn them that Harvey and Brooks had fought before and that Brooks had threatened to kill her son. However, just like with the other disappearances, the police did not follow up on the leads provided by friends and family. And they declared Harvey a runaway, saying that maybe he had left to get away from Brooks. They didn't investigate Brooks. Of course, this wasn't true, but they refused to see it or even look for clues about it. Unfortunately, this is one of the cases in the history of the Candyman that would remain unsolved for 35 years. Since all his photos were lost in the fire at his house, when his remains were finally found, they couldn't be identified. Years later, Harvey's sister saw the body and recognized him by his hair, but his mother didn't want to believe it. She knew he was dead and didn't want to know anything else. Harvey's mother died in 1994, 14 years later. The young man's sisters did what they had always been waiting to do, and 14 years later, the young man's sisters did what they had always been waiting to do. They gave the laboratory samples of her DNA, and that information, along with the forensic profiles, finally confirmed what she believed. The body was Harvey's. The only thing the sisters wanted was to give Harvey a funeral before they themselves died. In November 2008, they finally succeeded. The sisters later cremated him and planned to scatter his ashes in the lake, which was their mother's final resting place, saying, "He needs to be fishing with Mom. He has had a pretty tough life." On May 29th, David Hilligist, a 13-year-old boy, was kidnapped along with his friend Gregory Malley Winkle, who was 16 years old. Winkle had previously worked at Dean's Candy Factory. When they disappeared, the police once again ignored it. Because that night, Selma Winkle had received a call from her son saying that he was going to the beach to swim with some friends. So once again, they accused another young man of being a runaway, someone who had left home of his own free will. While Hilligist had planned a vacation trip with his family as soon as the school year ended, it was strange that he would have run away like that. Besides, he hadn't taken any money with him. Although what was truly incredible was that the police had seen so many young people disappear from their homes. And even so, they still thought that they were all definitely leaving because they wanted to run away from their parents or for other reasons. If they didn't want to work, they could have just said so. Can you tell that I'm angry with the Houston police? Henley, Dean Corll's other partner, helped in the search for the boys because he had been friends with Hilligist. Let me remind you that, according to him, up to that point, he didn't know what Dean was doing to the boys he brought to his house. But here he had started to put the pieces together and realized that something definitely wasn't right. The Hilligist family also borrowed money from a neighborhood credit union to hire a private investigator who came up with a new theory. The children might have been kidnapped by a man named Chicken Joe, known for providing male prostitutes to homosexual clients. The news led the Hilligist family, along with Cynthia and her son Stanley, to drive to the Montrose area in Houston, to sit outside the gay bar Silver Dollar Saloon, watching the door, hoping to see their son and brother. But this clearly didn't happen because these people had nothing to do with the case. Dorothy Hilligist never stopped looking for her son, and that's how she found much more information than the police got in the entire case. She went around asking people as part of her efforts, and that's how she realized that Molly, another one of the victims, had a friend with a Plymouth GTX. It turns out she had seen one of those cars in the neighborhood, with the license plate TMF724. This car was registered under the name Dean Corll, but since she didn't have the help of the police, she couldn't know that. If that had been the case would have been solved at that moment and many lives would have been saved. Dean still felt like he was being followed, so he moved to a new house again. And so, the deaths continued as if nothing had happened. On August 17, 1971, he kidnapped Reuben Watson, 17 years old. This boy called his father to tell him he wouldn't be coming home that night, but would go out partying with a friend. David Brooks was one of the only cases in which the name of one of the accomplices was revealed. But again, incredibly, to everyone's surprise, another teenager aged 13-17 has gone missing. No more runaway cases that police failed to investigate. Are surely just running away from their parents or something like that. Of course. On February 9, 1972, the son of the Houston Police Commissioner Willard Rusty Branch Jr. disappeared. And you might say it's good that he finally messed with a police officer because it's a tragedy, clearly. But even so, at least they'll be able to stop future murders. No, because the young man's father died of a heart attack a few weeks after the kidnapping. And it wasn't until 1985 that the remains were identified as those of the missing boy. According to Henley's testimony, the moment he realized what was happening was during the next murder. In his testimony, he claims ignorance of the previous ones. He also described that David Brooks was becoming quite sadistic in his involvement in the kidnappings and murders. On one occasion, Dean attacked Brooks by surprise and even raped him. However, Brooks continued to be involved in all of this. In 1972, on March 24th, they murdered Frank Aguirre, who was 17 years old. Henley was driving around with Dean and Brooks when they ran into Frank Aguirre, whom Henley invited to Dean's house to smoke marijuana. With the three of them, Frank agreed. He had told his girlfriend, Rhonda Williams, that he would come to pick her up after finishing his shift at work. Henry, a friend of Frank Aguirre, never arrived and even visited Aguirre's family months later. He asked if they knew anything, took some missing person flyers, left the house, and discarded them in the street. He helped his friend get into the car and then didn't seem to show any remorse. Did he go to the family's house? Yes, but most likely he was looking for answers about whether they knew anything about Dean Corll or if they were safe from the police. When he arrived with Frank at Dean's house, the young man was sexually abused, tortured, and later strangled. According to Henley, he tried to stop Dean, but he couldn't, and that's when he found out what had happened to his two friends who were missing. Dean told him how David Hilligist and Mally Winkle had been killed in the same way as the others who had died in Dean's room, and later buried in a rented shed. From this story comes the saying to never accept candy from strangers or get into a stranger's van, which is exactly what happened to the victims. On April 20th, 1972, Mark Scott, 17 years old, left his home to spend the weekend in Mexico, but he never came back. His family looked for him, but they couldn't find him, so they went to the Houston police. Honestly, what a joke. Mark had been arrested before for possessing a prohibited knife, so they decided he must have run away from home. That's why a few days after the disappearance, a letter arrived at this young man's family. Supposedly from Mark, saying that he was in Austin, Texas, and that he would stay there for a couple of days. He also said that he had found a job that paid him $3 an hour. He let us know that he would come back home when he had enough money to pay a lawyer. They tried to tell the police again that all of this was very suspicious. Mark hadn't taken his motorcycle. It was strange for him to go out looking for a job out of nowhere without it. But for the Houston Police Department, which at this point I'm convinced didn't have even an ounce of real desire to work, they kept saying that the real story was that the young man had run away from home. At this point, the parents of the missing young men were already starting to realize that there were coincidences. In several of the cases, one of the biggest coincidences was that the names Henley and Brooks appeared often, and as I mentioned, Mark carried a knife with him. When he was caught by Dean and his accomplices, he tried to defend himself while they tied his hands. He even managed to tear Dean's shirt and draw a little bit of blood with his knife. But it was still 3 against 1. He didn't have much chance of surviving, and in the end, he didn't, especially considering that Dean had a gun, which he pointed at him, making Mark give up. In 1969, Billy Bulge's parents had lost their son Marvin in a car accident and soon faced another loss. Their son, Billy Jean Bulge Jr., who had left together with his friend Johnny DeLome, who was 16 years old, a year younger than him. He supposedly sent them a letter saying he had gotten a job in Austin, the same story as before. They had left on May 21st, 1972, and a few days later, this letter arrived. Dear Mom and Dad, I'm sorry to do this, but Johnny and I found a better job. We're working for a truck driver who loads and unloads from Houston to Washington, and we'll be back in 3 or 4 weeks. After a week, I'll send money to help you and Mom. With love, Billy. Billy's father, who did that kind of work, knew that nothing like that existed at the time. Johnny's family received a very similar letter, but they knew their son couldn't write as well as what could be read in that letter. This time, the family began searching for answers independently, without involving the authorities. They remembered that David Brooks had once given marijuana to Billy, which they tried to report to the police. They also remembered that Dean Corll's house was a regular place for the neighborhood kids. Billy had once worked for Dean selling candy door to door. When Mrs. Bulge asked Billy what he and the other kids would do for hours at Dean Corll's house, Billy said, "We turn on the stereo and watch television, and Dean shows us things. One time he showed us his handcuffs. We were there with a couple of other guys, David Brooks and someone else, and they started playing with the handcuffs and put them on one of the guys. Then Dean couldn't find the key. He never found the key to take them off." Billy's father was very clear about it. It wasn't normal for a man that age to be playing with such young boys. Besides, games with handcuffs. There were teenagers and even some children. Even so, when Billy disappeared, one of the first people his parents called to keep an eye out in case they saw him was Dean Corll. They also made a call to Wayne Henley to see if he knew anything, and both said they would do what they could, apparently concerned. In reality, they weren't genuinely concerned about the boys. Billy Bulge and Johnny DeLome were tied to Carl's bed, and after Dean was done with them, he strangled Bulge. DeLome was still alive, trapped on the bed beside his friend's corpse. Henley shouted at that moment, "Hello, Johnny," and shot the boy when he turned his head, wounding him. He said, "I think the bullet ended up in his nose," and this boy looked up and said, "Wayne, why did you shoot me?" "Please, Wayne, please don't do it," but Henley shot again, this time killing him. Both boys were finally buried at High Island Beach. During the time Carl lived on Schuler Street, the trio lured a 19-year-old boy named Billy Ridinger to the house. Ridinger was tied to the wooden board, tortured and abused by Dean. Brooks later claimed that she persuaded Dean to allow Ridinger to be released, and the young man was allowed to leave the residence. In other words, he actually survived. Obviously, later on, when all of this was discovered, many people wondered why Ridinger didn't say anything. There were those who even accused him of letting more young people die at the hands of the Candyman because he didn't go to the police. But let's be realistic. Did you hear everything I told you before? Not only would he be embarrassed while making the report, but also have to go through all the trauma of a trial like that. But on top of that, probably, the police wouldn't have done anything except call him a liar and laugh at him. I don't think you can blame him for not wanting to talk about it. Meanwhile, Dean kept moving to avoid being found out. Stephen Sickman, 17, vanished on July 19, 1972. The day he disappeared, he and his younger sister, Sandy, had a fight. She was 3 years younger than her brother and had developed a crush on one of his friends. She said, "We were a typical brother and sister. We annoyed each other and got on each other's nerves." The family reported her disappearance, but the police thought she was just another runaway. His mother, Irma, was alone and drove around the city for weeks looking for him without success. Even Sandy initially thought her brother had left home since he talked all the time about moving to Baja California. She said, "He was a typical teenager trying to figure out what he had to do for himself." Stephen was protective of his younger sister, especially because he suffered burns when he was a baby, which forced him to wear a wig instead of hair. So he always defended her. They did everything together. He was always protecting her. The night she disappeared after their fight, he had gone to Sandy's room to apologize to her, and it was the first time he had ever apologized. He even promised to take her to Astroworld, an amusement park in Houston that has since closed. "We took care of each other," said Sandy. "He was a good boy. I miss him terribly." Sigmund played the guitar and drums. He loved to draw. He loved being outdoors. He liked hanging out with his friends and surfing at the beach. He earned money working part-time at the local Dairy Queen and cooked a lot at home. The family says the void he left was enormous. And even though Irma contacted the police after learning about the murders in Houston and asked if any of the bodies found could be her son, but they ignored her. I don't know why I keep talking to you about the police. They were really useless in Houston. It makes me wonder if it was the same with the rest of the cases. And the place was just constant chaos. Stephen became one of those bodies identified many years later, on August 21st, 1972. Roy Bunton left his house for work as an assistant at a shoe store located in Northwest Mall. The mall had only been open for 3 years and was considered one of the largest retail shopping areas in the city. He traveled on foot and never made it to work or back home. In 2009, Bunton's sister called the forensic anthropologist who was working to identify the remains in this case and described her brother Bunton. He was tall and blonde, with a big smile and unusually long legs. In 2010, when forensic tests determined that Michael Bolch's body was not buried in his family's grave, it was also determined that the remains buried as Michael Volk actually belonged to Roy Bunton. The police gave answers to Bunton's sister, who had always wondered if her brother, whose disappearance fit the profile, had been one of Dean Corll's victims. On October 2nd, Wally J. Simonox and Richard Hembry, 14 and 13 years old, were victims of Dean Corll. They were going to spend the night together. Once night fell, Simonox contacted his mother by phone and shouted, "Mom!" before being disconnected from the line. Those were the last words she heard from her daughter, her son. On November 12th of the same year, Richard Allen Kepner disappeared from Heights when he was on his way to call his fiancée from a public phone. He was found buried at High Island Beach, but it wouldn't be until September of 1983 that his remains would be identified. Kepner was 19 years old and his family thought he was going through a rebellious phase. That's why they believed what the police said, that he had run away. Joseph Lyles, 17 years old, was Dean's 28th victim, for whom he didn't need any help. The young man lived near his house, and by then Henley had moved a bit farther away, so he couldn't help him with all the boys. So he decided to do it alone to satisfy his appetite, so to speak. He was one of the young men who took years to identify and who was finally brought to light thanks to advances in DNA technology. A little over a month after moving into his apartment on Weird Road, Dean moved into his father's old house at 2020 Lamar Drive. If it weren't for his end, which was near, experts have said that it was most likely that Dean created his own space for his so-called games. A hidden place in the house, similar to other cases of murderers in which they create their own office perfect for killing. They say this because at that time he was in a stable place where he could stay indefinitely. As you can see, the crimes happened over long periods of time between them and in 1973. He didn't attack again until the middle of the year, but the kidnappings became much more frequent. Actually, it's said that his little hiatus was because he was sick for a few months, which kept him from having the energy to continue. Henley describes how he perceived Dean when he wanted to kill again. He said you could feel his bloodlust, it showed in his movements. He recalls starting to smoke, an unusual habit for him, while simultaneously expressing his desire for another son. By that time, a few years had already passed since they started working, so to speak, and by July of 73, David Brooks got married, so to speak, and by July of 73, David Brooks married his fiancée, who was pregnant, and her name was Bridget Jones. Clearly, having a family, he could no longer take care of the work they were doing, so he left Henley alone with Dean. I must say it was probably for the best, because if he had been there for the next attacks, we might not be telling the same story. Let's remember that he was also described by Henley as someone with a certain bloodlust, a violent person, and it may be that as things went on in the final moments, he was there to defend Dean more than to attack him, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On June 4th of that year, Dean kidnapped Billy Ray Lawrence, who was 15 years old. Lawrence told his father that night that he was going to stay out fishing with some friends and would come home in a few days. Unlike his previous victims, Dean kept this young man alive for 4 days. On the family side, Lawrence and his father didn't have the best relationship. The father himself said that once he caught him smoking marijuana, he hit him and then made him throw away the cigarette. And after this, Lawrence tried to get his life back on track by buying a new bicycle for $150 in installments. And he got himself a girlfriend with whom he was very happy, who was 5 years older than him. But one night, his bicycle, which he had worked for and was still paying off, was stolen. And from then on, he started having problems at school. The truth is, seeing all this, his parents weren't very surprised when they heard he was going on a fishing trip. They also weren't surprised when they received a letter from their son saying he had gotten a job in Austin and would be staying there for the whole summer. Lawrence's father, who deeply regrets what happened with his son, finds comfort in the fact that the last words they exchanged before he disappeared were "I love you." And to add a bit of perversity to all this, Henley called about a month later to ask about his supposed friend. And a few days after this, after calling the house, the place was mysteriously robbed. Someone who knew the layout of the house and its nooks and crannies had done it. And even though they suspected Lawrence's friends, it wasn't specifically Dean and Henry. That same month, the Candyman also killed Raymond Blackburn, who was 20 years old, the oldest victim of this man. Blackburn was already married and was on his way to see his newborn son. Then, on July 13th, the Candyman killed Homer Luis Garcia, who was 15 years old. He had met Henry at this driving school in Bel Air on July 7th of that year. Garcia called his father to tell him that he would spend the night with some friends. They let him bleed to death in a bathtub. Where was the police? Why ask if they already know the answer? They weren't there. Spoiler alert, they weren't there. On July 12th, John Manning Sellers disappeared 2 days before his 18th birthday. Actually, it's believed that he ran into Henley and Dean while they were hiding a body, and that's why they shot him 3 times in the chest and buried him with all his clothes on. 6 days later, Dean killed Michael Anthony Bolsch, who was also 15 years old. And if the last name sounds familiar, it's because Tony was Billy's brother, whom Dean had killed just a year earlier. The difference is that he was known as a fugitive. He had already run away from home 3 times but always returned. So didn't they search for him using that reasoning? July 19th, 1973. Janie, Mike's mother, gave him some money to get a haircut and also to buy a pack of cigarettes. And the young man simply walked out the door. That moment when he walked out the door would be the last time Janie and Billie Jean Sr. would see their son. Billie Jean Sr., seeing that another one of her children was missing, called the police, as she should. She also found it odd that her son was supposed to buy something, in addition to not returning after his haircut. He wouldn't have taken the new shoes his grandmother had bought him, nor any clothes to change into. Did she want to report the disappearance? The police's response was basically the same as always. What do you want us to do about it? So Bolge started driving around the neighborhood looking for her children, both Billy and Michael, who was now also missing. They would find Tony's body later in Dean's boathouse, although his remains were among the unidentified for a while. And unfortunately, the parents would bury the wrong body in their family plot. On July 25th, Dean murdered Marty Jones, 18 years old, and Charles Kerry Cobble, 17 years old. Before he died, Marty Jones was forced to watch as they tortured, sexually assaulted, and shot his best friend to death. While he waited for his turn, Henley struggled to kill him and eventually had to call Dean to finish the job. Henley buried them both in the boat shed without the help of any of the other killers. And now we have the last victim of Dean Arnold Corll, the Candyman. He was James Dremala, a 13-year-old boy whom he murdered on August 3, 1973. The teenager was planning to take his girlfriend to see Live and Let Die, the latest James Bond movie, and he had been collecting bottles to pay for the date, which would be that Sunday. He wanted to go to a convenience store at that moment to return the bottles, but his mother asked him not to go and told him, "I don't want you to go out riding your bike after dark." He didn't listen to her, got on his bike and said, "Oh, Mom, I'll be back in a few minutes. I won't be gone for long." They never saw him again. He was never late. He never left without telling anyone. It was very strange that he had just disappeared, so something had to be wrong. His sister Michelle jokingly remembered him as a good big brother, sweet, affectionate, and loving, and as bad as he could be with his little sister. His parents remember him as a boy frozen in that moment, riding away on his bicycle toward a horrible encounter with death. Rimala was riding a bicycle in Pasadena, not far from where Dean lived, at his father's house. When the trio saw him with his bottles, they lured him in with a story about some empty Coca-Cola bottles that Dean had supposedly found in his truck, and that the boy, if he wanted, could keep them because he really didn't need them and wanted to get rid of them. Rimala took the bottles to the store and then went back to the truck to thank Dean. That's when this man remembered that he had a bunch of bottles at his house. Drimala was invited to a party in Pasadena. She called her father to ask for permission to stay. Her father told her no, to be home in 20 minutes, and ended the phone call. This was their final conversation. Shortly after making the call, Drimala was already on the wooden board. The murder of this young man was so terrible, according to reports, that Dean had to wear an apron to protect his clothes from the blood. Days later, on the night of August 7th, Henley had prepared to deliver a new victim to Dean, a friend of his named Timothy Cordell Curley, 19 years old. Henley carried out his plan as he usually did, inviting the victim to Dean's house to drink beer and smoke marijuana. However, that night the plans changed a little. Once at the house, Curley and Henry drank alcohol and sniffed paint until around midnight when they got hungry. So at that time, they drove Curley's Volkswagen to Henry's house, where they met one of Henry's friends. Rhonda Williams, 15 years old, who had had an argument with her drunk father and had decided to leave the house until he sobered up. Williams had been very worried since that night when her fiancé, Frank Aguirre, disappeared. And things with her father were not good at all, so she was definitely very sad at that moment. Henley also invited her then to Dean's house, and the three of them got into Curley's car returning to Pasadena. They arrived around 3 in the morning on August 8th, and when Dean saw them, he got terribly angry. He showed a lot of anger for having brought a woman to his house. That night, the 3 teenagers drank and did drugs until they passed out, including Henley. Hours later, when she woke up in the early morning of August 8th, Henley found herself tied up and gagged. And next to her were Timothy and Rhonda, also in the same situation. When Ian realized that Henley had regained consciousness, he removed her gag and told her he was going to kill all 3 of them for bringing Rhonda to the house. Henley attempted to negotiate with Dean, who aimed a .22 caliber gun at her stomach, offering to help him torture the others if he released her. That's how Dean untied Henley. And both of them tied Timothy and Rhonda to the torture board, where Dean began to torture and rape Timothy, who had already regained consciousness. Rhonda also woke up while Henley was undressing her, and that's when she asked him what was going on. She was asking him if all of that was real, thinking, or rather hoping, that it was just a sick joke. When Henley answered yes, that it was indeed real, Rhonda asked him what he was going to do about it. That's when Henley decided to confront Dean. He took his gun and said, "Have you gone far enough?" "Dean, I can't go on anymore. I can't let you kill all my friends." Dean started moving toward Henley, yelling at him to kill him, provoking him because he really believed he wouldn't do it. But in the end, Henley started shooting and Dean tried to run out of the room until he finally got the shot that killed him. At 8:30 in the morning, Henley called the police and reported that he had killed Dean. Once the police arrived at his house, they began to find the torture items such as ropes, handcuffs, knives, and sex toys. The police detained Henley, who openly confessed to all the crimes he had been involved in. Meanwhile, on the other hand, David Brooks went to the police station with his father and denied his involvement in the crimes. But he admitted knowing about the tortures thanks to Henley's statements. That day, 8 bodies were found in a shed belonging to Dean Corll, while it took years for the rest of the bodies to be discovered. The autopsies on the victims' bodies revealed horrifying sexual torture. Their pubic hair had been ripped out, their genitals chewed, and they had been penetrated with glass tubes which were then broken inside their bodies. Williams, for her part, spent weeks in the Harris County Juvenile Probation Office, where she was completely unaware of the horrifying search for bodies in so many graves, the stories of sexual abuse, torture, and deaths. She didn't know anything. She considered Henley her savior for a long time, but he was also the person because of whom she had found herself in that situation in the first place. It took her a long time to come to a solution, and she had to gather the courage to go to the prison and talk to him to finally resolve what had happened that night. She told the police that after Henley killed Dean, he turned to Curly, shocked, and said, "If you weren't my friend, I could have gotten $1,500 for you." She thought it was horrible, really, and that stayed in her mind for a long time, for many years. Curly, for her part, said she had 2 options, either accept it and move on, or take her own life. She also didn't know if she would forgive Henley for what she had done after all. Actually, that night he was about to become just another victim. It's not like she would thank him for saving him, because it wasn't for him. Henley saved himself. Curly spent years struggling with depression, alcoholism, and post-traumatic stress disorder, while Williams tried to be friends with Henley. The Williams situation basically concluded the day that Henley told her in prison that night he almost shot her in the head, that he considered it. So she closed that chapter of her life. After this, she left and Curly never contacted this man again. So the 2 of them tried to move on with their lives, trying to recover from what had happened to them. Henley, for her part, began giving names, talking about the victims and saying where they were. She helped the police for years to recover every body she knew about. The police also brought 4 inmates from the local prison to the main site to do the digging. And after clearing the debris from the surface, they got to work. 6 inches down, they found a shoe, some money, and a watch. Under a layer of white lime, the first body was found, a naked teenager wrapped in plastic with a heavy cord around his neck. That was James Dremala, 13 years old, Dean's last victim. At the same time, news reports began to appear about one of the most horrific cases they had ever seen. Also, that day, as the bodies began to appear, Henley asked to use the phone to call his mother. And while they were recording him, he told her that he had killed Dean and that he had led those boys to their deaths. He was crying while his mother tried to ask him if she could come be with him. Many families found out while the police were just discovering that their children were buried there. Despite agreeing to confess, David Brooks refused to take responsibility for any of the murders. And he has been silent since he originally wrote his confession after Wayne Hanley shot Dean Corll. But at the police station before his arrest, he gave his version of what happened. He had been incited by his father, who had taken him to jail. This is the letter he wrote. "My name is David Brooks. I'm 18 years old and I live at 145 Peck with my wife Bridget. Actually, I never killed anyone, but I was in the room when it happened and I was supposed to help if something went wrong. The first murder I remember happened when Dean was living at the Yorktown house. There were 2 kids there and I left before they were killed, but Dean told me he had killed them afterwards. I don't know where they were buried or what their names were. The first ones Dean killed were supposed to be sent somewhere in California. The first killing I remember witnessing was in San Felipe, 6,363. That boy was Reuben Haney. Dean and I were the only people involved in that, but Dean did the killing and I was present when it happened. I also remember 2 kids who were killed at the Place 1 apartments in Mangum. They were brothers, and their father worked at the house next door, where they were building some more apartments. I was there when Dean killed them, strangling them, but again, I didn't take part. I think I was there when they buried them, but I don't remember where they buried them. The youngest of these 2 boys is the youngest who was killed, I think. I remember a boy who was killed at Dean's house in Colombia. This was right before Wayne Henley came into the picture. Dean kept this boy in the house for about 4 days before killing him. I don't remember his name, but we picked him up on 11th and Rutland, I think. I think I also helped bury this boy, but I don't remember where it was. This was about 2 years ago. It really bothered Dean to have to kill this boy because he really liked him. A boy named Glass was also killed at the Columbia address. I took him home once, but he insisted on returning to Dean's house. After I got him back, Dean killed him. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure if Glass was the one I took home or if it was another boy, but I think it was Glass. It was during the time we lived on Columbia Street that Wayne Henley got involved. Wayne helped get the boys at first, and later he took an active part in the murders. Wayne seemed to enjoy causing pain, and he was especially sadistic towards Schuler. Most of the murders that happened after Wayne showed up didn't involve all 3 of them. I still didn't take part in the actual murder, but almost always the 3 of us were there. Mark Scott was killed at Schuler's address. Yesterday I said in my witness statement that Mark Scott was at the Schuler house, but I didn't say that I was present, which I was. Mark had a knife and tried to catch Dean. He hit him with a knife and grabbed Dean's shirt. With one hand still tied, Dean grabbed the hand holding the knife, which had barely cut his skin. Wayne ran out of the room and grabbed a gun, and Mark just gave up. Wayne killed Mark Scott, and I think he strangled him. Mark was buried on the beach or in the boathouse. Was there another boy killed at Schuler? Actually, there were 2. This time a boy named Billy Bulge and another named Johnny, and I think his last name was Malone. Wayne strangled Billy and said, "Hey, Johnny," and when Johnny looked up, Wayne shot him in the forehead with a .22 caliber. A bullet came out of his ear. He got up, and about 3 minutes later he said, "Wayne, please don't do it." Then Wayne strangled him and Dean helped. It was while we were living in Schuler that Wayne and Dean caught me and started to kill me. I begged Dean not to kill me, and he finally let me go. I talked about this in my witness statement yesterday, and that part of my statement was absolutely true. It was also in this direction where they caught Billy Riedinger, and what I said in my witness statement about him was true. I took care of him while he was there, and I believe the only reason he's alive now is because I begged them not to kill him. Wayne and Dean had a boy alone while we were at Schuler. He was a tall, skinny guy. I just walked into the house and there he was. I left before they killed him. In the first apartment we lived in at Westcott Towers, I think there were 2 boys killed. They were both young men from the Heights area, but I don't know their names. Wayne accidentally shot one of them. This was around 7 in the morning. I was in the other room sleeping when this happened. Dean told me that Wayne had just come in waving the .22 caliber and accidentally shot one of the boys in the mouth. The bullet penetrated the skin and was visible underneath. The 2 boys were not killed instantly, but later on. That day, Dean moved to Princessa Apartments on Wheat Road, and I remember he took a boy there. Alone. He wanted me to help him, but I wouldn't do it. I didn't want to mess with this guy because I had somewhere I wanted to go, so I tried to make him mad so he'd leave, but he wanted to stay. Dean grabbed the boy, and within 3 minutes of when he grabbed him, I was gone. At that time, I was using Dean's car, so I was coming and going all the time. After Princessa Apartments, Dean moved to Pasadena. I know of 2 who were killed there. One was from Baton Rouge, and the other was a little blonde boy from South Houston. I saw the boy from South Houston for about 45 minutes. I brought him a pizza and then I left, and he wanted me to come back. I wasn't there when those 2 boys were killed. In total, I guess there were between 25 and 30 kids killed, and they were buried in 3 different places. I was present and helped bury many of them, but not all of them. I think there are 3 or 4 buried in Sam Rayburn. I'm sure there are 2 there. With the first one in Sam Rayburn, I helped them bury him. The next one we took to Sam Rayburn. And when we got there, Dean and Wayne found out that the first one had come to the surface and that a foot or a hand was above the ground. When they buried him the second time, they put some kind of plastic sheet on top to keep him down. The third place where they were buried was at High Island Beach. This was right next to the Winnie exit, where the road goes to the beach. I turned east onto the beach road and drove until the pavement changed, which is about a quarter or half a mile. And the bodies were on the right side of the road, about 15 or 20 yards from it. Actually, I never buried one there, but I always drove the car. One of the graves had a large rock on top. I think there are 5 more bodies buried in this place. The bodies on the beach are lined up for maybe half a mile, more or less. I'm willing to show the officers where this place is, and I'll try to locate as many graves as possible. I'm sorry that this happened, and I feel for the families of the children. I'm making this statement of my own free will, and I haven't been promised anything. As you can see, this is different from what I previously told you, which would all be mostly based on experience and Henley's testimony. Both of them had different views of what happened. And actually, we can't know the truth because the third player in all of this is no longer alive. He wasn't alive at that time to say what was true and what wasn't. Anyway, even if we sit here and think who could have done things worse, both of them were involved in the murders one way or another. In a similar letter, Henley also formally admitted to the crimes. Henley and Brooks were tried separately for their involvement in the murders, which are known today as the Houston Massacre. Both were sentenced to life in prison, Henley in 1974 and Brooks in 1975, and they were never granted parole. Brooks died on May 28, 2020 from coronavirus at the age of 65, while Henley is still alive and in prison. But the story itself doesn't end there. The repercussions of the case are many. Firstly, as you might have noticed, Dean took many boys who had close connections, and for some of his friends, it was basically like a horror movie where the young people around them kept disappearing. In that position, you wonder who's next. Worse still, they had no idea how the boys were disappearing. The police in action implied there was no danger, suggesting that the missing people had simply run away. Despite the absence of warning signs, the events unfolded, contradicting the initial statement. And on the other hand, Rhonda was accused of being an accomplice and of playing the victim. Her own sister said that her testimony wasn't true, that she hadn't run away from her father that night, that he wasn't bad to Rhonda, or at least not how she described it. Also, at the time, the police chief's conclusion was that all gays were depraved and sexual predators. They eagerly explored all the gay bars they could find in the city. Look, it didn't work. Going to every gay bar waiting for depraved people didn't solve anything. Besides, it's a bit frustrating that they want to work afterwards when there was a clear line of repetitive events happening right under their noses. Their attempt to play heroes only resulted in stigmatizing many people. At least in this case, they were able to find where the bodies were, and the families who lost these young people were able to mourn them properly. At least they know what happened to them, unlike so many other stories that left with nothing, covered up in doubt. It's worth noting that Rhonda publicly testified in 2013 when the internet was already a vast platform for people to share their opinions freely. They even went so far as to accuse her of being part of what was happening when her boyfriend disappeared, which is obviously a strong statement to make. On the other hand, Henley has defended her by saying that she was the push he needed to finally kill Dean. The fact that she believed she was capable of getting them out of that situation and standing up to this man is what finally made him pull the trigger. More on the personal side too. Dean was keeping a very close eye on Hendy's little brother Ronnie, and he definitely didn't want him anywhere near his brother. So sooner or later he would have to face this situation, in which either he died or Dean died, or he let his brother fall prey to the Candyman. And well, that's the whole story for today. Tell me what you think and if you knew about this case. I'm really tired now. I'm gonna take off all my makeup and I'm going to keep working. Anyway, follow me on social media. If you made it this far, congrats. While at it, follow me on Instagram. Because yeah, what do I know? If you want to follow me on Instagram, that's perfect. It's the social network I recommend for following me. Sometimes I post when a video is published, because sometimes it gets delayed with all this recording for 2 hours. Lengthy cases may face delays soon. I hope not, but I'm being realistic. And if you want to send me pictures of your pets, please do it. It's a good part of my day to receive pet photos. I love them. So, well, that's it for now. Here are the Patreons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those platforms. And with nothing else to say, here you have a new video, here you have a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Goodbye.